Good afternoon, Pam. It's great to have the opportunity to interview you for our JIA Awareness Week that's coming up in July. And thank you so much for giving us some of your precious time, as I know it's an incredibly busy time for you right now. For our audience, I'm Ailsa Bosworth. I'm founder and national patient champion for the National Rheumatoid Arthritis Society. And I'm joined this afternoon by member of the Scottish Parliament for the Labour Party in the Glasgow region, Pam Duncan-Glancy, who was diagnosed with juvenile idiopathic arthritis at the tender age of 18 months. Pam, you're very welcome, and thank you for supporting our JIA Awareness Week for 2024, and for having supported us in previous years. Your support means a lot to us. Can I start by asking you to tell me what your first memories were of having JIA as a child? Because of course you were incredibly young. You wouldn't have remembered back to when you were 18 months. So what are your first memories?
The very first thing I can remember that I suppose would be definitely about having arthritis was complaining about having sore knees. And I think what I said to my mum was, and my dad presumably as well, I've got sore leggies is how I described it. And I remember that specifically. I remember my knees being quite big at the time, so obviously swollen, but I wouldn't have known anything other than why are my knees big. And also I was obviously in quite a bit of pain. And then another really vivid memory, I don't know how long between being that, feeling the pain initially, and then this memory was past, but I was in hospital and I was handed a little red pan, a toy, obviously, like a child's toy. It was red and it had like a little yellow face on the lid. And at the same time as I was handed it to play with, I was handed a cup of medicine, and it was hydroxychloroquine, I think, at the time. And I couldn't bear it. It was like the most disgusting tasting thing I've ever had. I mean, I don't know if it would be that bad now, but when I was that, I would have been about 5 or 6, and I remember it being horrific. But I remember as soon as I'd had it and feeling really quite, oh, that was horrible. Then I remember going to play with the pan on this little cooker and stove that they'd set out, obviously, again, a kid's toy, and immediately feeling much, much better. So those are the kind of, but odd, but they really, both of those situations, so feeling sore knees and then the little pan in the playroom in the hospital getting the horrible medicine, are probably my 2 earliest memories of having arthritis.
Gosh. So how long did it take your parents to actually get a diagnosis? Because we know from parents today that it can still be difficult getting a diagnosis for JIA. It takes time sometimes. And we're talking about over 40 years ago. So, you know, when the drugs and treatment that we have today just weren't available. So what have your parents told you of that time of getting that diagnosis?
I think it was quite a long time. I can't remember specifically like when I was 3 or 4 or whatever, but it was a few years. And that it took them to get to the normal, the right diagnosis. I believe originally the doctors had thought I had Still's disease, which is quite a sort of older term, but related, and is another immunosuppressant condition, I think. And so they wrongly thought I had that. Initially, they just thought I had sore knees and didn't bother too much about it. But my mum and dad were like, no, this is not normal. Like, something's not right here. Like, it's more than just a couple of sore knees. My mum was pretty tenacious. And I remember she said that when I started to walk and I would complain about how my knees were sore, she'd be like, oh, just keep going, kind of thing. And then obviously once I was diagnosed, she kind of thought, well, maybe there's a thing here. But I think it took quite a while, and we lived in the north of Scotland at the time, so there was only really one kind of hospital that dealt with it, which was in Aberdeen, the sick kids in Aberdeen. And I remember my consultant was Dr. Ochterlony, and I can still remember him to this day, and my surgeon, Mr. Rennie. And I used to go and visit them quite a lot, but I think they were kind of the earliest people that my mum and dad got to meet who finally kind of diagnosed me, and I started to go to their clinics quite regularly.
I know from what I've read about your story that your mum Jackie really fought for you and to give you the same access to school that your sister Jen and the other children had, so that you didn't miss out. Can you tell me a bit about how your school days and how your symptoms and so on, what you were feeling both physically and emotionally, how did that impact you?
So I went to 3 different primary schools because my dad was made redundant in his job, so we moved about a wee bit. And all of those primary schools, none of them had like wheelchair access. And by the time I was in primary school, I was using a wheelchair because the condition that I had, the version of arthritis that I had, was quite aggressive. And as you've said a moment ago, Ailsa, the kind of drugs that are available now that probably would have prevented that, progressing to that extent, would have meant I wouldn't have been in that situation. But nonetheless, anyway, I was in a wheelchair by the time I was in primary school. So they had to fight to get access to the mainstream primary schools because they weren't accessible. So the first option offered was go to the one that is accessible, which is the special school. And my mum and dad wanted me to go to the same school as my sister. So she was only a year younger than me. But they wanted, so I was obviously going to school before her, but they knew she'd eventually be going, and they wanted me to be at the same school. So in the first school I went to, in the first area, they were like, no, she has to go to the local mainstream school. So they put in a ramp, and then same happened again when we had to move to another school. Same story, same argument, same fight. And they put in a ramp. And then my dad got a third job and we had to move again. And when we moved that time, I think it was in about primary 5 by this point, again, they had to adapt that school. And they also had to put in an accessible toilet, if I remember rightly, in that one. Because by that point, I think the wheelchair I was using was too big to get into any other sort of normal toilet, if you want to call it that, non-accessible toilet, rather. So, yeah, and then when I went to high school, I only went to one high school, and it was actually quite a new school at the time. So it was already kind of accessible, so they didn't have to do anything. So physically, they had to make some changes. They also had to make sure that I had someone with me, because I couldn't, like, my arms don't move much, so I can't reach anything that's really kind of out with a very, very short stretch. I can't carry things, I still can't. I can't help myself to the toilet, I can't get food, etc. So I had to have someone with me quite a lot when I was in school. Sometimes that was my sister, but in general it was because they provided a support assistant, which was really helpful. There were days when I remember being in so much pain that I would go to the medical room, it was called at the time, and they'd have to phone my mum because I'd be lying on the floor, the only position I could get into comfortably, with my legs like wide open because my hips had kind of locked into that position. And my mum had to come and effectively shut them and kind of manipulate my legs back together and get me in my wheelchair. And I remember that happening a few times. And that started to get more prevalent around about the age of 12 or 13, which is when they considered that I might need to go and have hip replacements. It's another story which I can come on to if you want to, but I didn't ever get hip replacements, and I still have never had any hip or joint replacements. But at the time, they thought, that's what I would need. So I was in a lot of pain, and I remember that. I remember my mum also, like, she's quite a funny woman. She's not, my mum's dead now, but she was quite funny. And sometimes I could see the teachers and the staff being like, oh my God, did you just say that? Like, she used to come in and she'd say to me, and I'd be in quite a bit of pain. She'd be like, right, come on, let's get up. And I'm like, I'm really sore. And I'd be crying, and she'd be like, is crying helping? And I'd be like, no. She's like, well, stop it and let's get in your wheelchair. So like, which makes it sound like she was the warmest, most incredible woman you've ever met, but she was also really, really pragmatic. And she'd just be like, this is like, you're in a lot of pain, crying isn't helping you, let's just get on with this. And that kind of get on with it. So she'd come in, do what she needed to do, and then the school would be like, is Pam going to go home with you? My mum would be like, no, it's 12 o'clock, she's going to stay for the rest of the day, and be educated. So that's kind of what my school was like. And then I spent a bit of time out of school in hospital. So when I went down to London to have surgery, which ended up being soft tissue surgery rather than joint replacement, but it was intended, I was supposed to get joints replaced, but in the end the soft tissue around about the joints was so shot to pieces that there was no point replacing the joint because it wouldn't have been supported. So that's why I ended up getting soft tissue treatment and surgery. And so I was in hospital for about 6 months, and so I was, I think I would have been in 3rd year at the time, 3rd or 4th year. So all of my school work was done in hospital. So the school and the education service in the hospital in London communicated with each other, and I never missed anything really. I didn't have to skip a year or anything.
That's amazing. We actually had a children's hospital here near us in Berkshire, in Taplow. It was the British Red Cross Memorial Hospital that was set up by Barbara Ansell, who you may very well know.
Yes.
And the children came from all over the country, and they lived in the hospital. Their parents brought them with their luggage, and they lived in the hospital because there were no treatments. There was, steroids and physiotherapy and all of that sort of thing. It must be very familiar to you.
Yeah, and I remember Barbara Ansell. My doctor was she was visiting Aberdeen, and my doctor phoned my mum and said, I'd like you to bring Pamela, as she would have called me, in to meet Barbara Ansell, because Pam was such a kind of, I was quite a weird case, basically, or unusual. And so I met Barbara Ansell, and it was Barbara Ansell who suggested I go down to London to Middlesex Hospital for the surgery that I then got, which was incredibly successful. I still use a wheelchair, but until I had that surgery, I couldn't stand up, and now I can walk a bit. So she was transformative, that woman.
So how did having JIA affect family life generally, and your sister's experience of childhood? Because, of course, the siblings are affected by what's going on in the family dynamic as well.
Yeah, very much so. I'm really close to my sister, and I still am. She lives next door to me, and we do so much together. Growing up, we were just joined at the hip, basically. We just always did things together. We were great friends. She's the best friend I ever have and will ever want and need. She's incredible. And she did so much for me when I was young. She was my sister, my friend, my carer, my advocate, my fighter. She just did loads for me, and it did take its toll on her. And I know that, for example, there was one time, there was a school trip, and she was going to Paris, and the school wouldn't take me because they didn't have the support that they could provide for me. And my mum wouldn't fly because she doesn't like flying, and we couldn't really afford as a family to pay for someone to go. And Jen was really quite, she was like, oh, I'm going to go to Paris and you're not going to be able to come. And it was such a big deal that my mum negotiated with the local social work department that I would go on a respite holiday to France, so that I would get to France. I didn't get to go to Disney World like Jen did. I ended up going to Lourdes, which was a very different experience. And as you might imagine, and it was great. And I should say that it was out of the ordinary for our family because we didn't have any religion at all. But it was an opportunity for me to be able to go to France, and my mum took it, and so concerned that Jen was, and my mum and dad were, that we would have a different experience, that we sought out such an experience in France for me to have, so that Jen and I would still be able to share the same experience of going abroad, because neither of us had been abroad till then. So yeah, we did almost everything together. Yeah. And when I was away in hospital, it really affected her, and I really missed her. And I know that it affected her, and I know that she had a difficult time at school and went through a really, really difficult time. But now she's we're doing great. She's amazing. She's an inspiration. She's an incredible, incredible woman who's career driven, focused. Yeah, she's unbelievable.
Very lucky to have a sister like that. Wow.
Yeah.
So just going back to school for a moment, there's a big difference between primary school and secondary school, and how kids are kind of looked after and so on. How did you cope with that transition? And I imagine that your mother will have had to have done a lot more fighting for getting you the right support so that you could stay in and be in lessons, because of course you have to move classrooms for every lesson and so on, which of course you don't in primary school. So a big change, was it?
It was a huge change. And I think I'm lucky because the process of transition from primary to secondary was really, really good. Both schools worked really well together, and with my mum and dad and Jen and me. So it was really good. But it was different. It was really different, as you say. The moving around was tricky. I had to get an electric wheel. Well, I didn't have to, but it became really clear that an electric wheelchair, a powered wheelchair, as opposed to a manual wheelchair, would have been better, if not necessary. I hadn't had one before. So there was money raised. We raised money as a family, and the school raised money as well. I got a wheelchair so that I could get myself around. And I had a member of staff that would meet me at the beginning and end of every lesson. I remember one particular day, and I'll tell you this story because I think it's an interesting one, was a friend of mine, my best friend at school, and still basically came to meet me at the end of class. At the end of the day, was kind of following me out and wanting, taking me to taxi and such. And one of the people who was unusual in the role, because this person, I think she was covering for something, but she was effectively the carer for the day. And she said, "You're slowing us down. You're hindering getting Pam out of the building," kind of thing. Now, knowing what I know now, which is the care staff were paid till 3:30. So I too would have wanted to leave at 3:30 if I wasn't being paid beyond that, right? But the school day ended at 3:30, so you can understand the issue. And I remember being really upset because it wasn't often that friends did come with me at the end of the day and like walk out the building like everybody else did. And so I turned to my friend and I said, "Just ignore her." And I got an after school detention for it, for telling a pupil to ignore a member of staff. And my mum, I was told I got lines in it, and my mum basically said to me, "If they ask you to write lines, you should write that you will treat members of staff with the respect they give you," which is what I did, because I was so we were really, really angry. I understand why she said what she said, and I have a very, very different view and lens and all that to see it through now. But at the time, I was a young person in a school wanting to go out of school with my pal, and it was really difficult.
Yeah,
that's probably one of the most difficult experiences. Genuinely, I had a good time, and it's because the staff in the school were incredible.
Mm-hmm. Great. So I believe your disease sort of burnt itself out, if we can use that expression. I don't really like that expression, but I've seen it in some of your material in your early teens. So you were about 13 or thereabouts. But of course, you were left with the destructive effects that JIA has wrought on you. And so you had to face your teenage years and growing into early adulthood, dealing with that level of disability. What can you tell us a bit about that time? What were your aspirations as a teenager? What were some of the barriers you faced as you sort of started to think gradually about the world of work and what you might do?
It was a difficult time, being that age is difficult for a girl anyway, to be honest. Going through all the kind of changes your body goes through, and then, added on top of all of that, you had a body like mine, which just didn't look like anyone else's. So you've got all of that kind of internalized sort of self-consciousness, which made that time quite difficult. And, it's taken me till significantly into my adulthood to be able to really accept my body and the shape that it is and the way that it moves and not really be bothered about that anymore, other than the fact that it's, sore and restrictive. But I mean, not in terms of a self-conscious way, and just kind of accept I am who I am. But at the time it was difficult. There's no doubt about it. At that age, and I was quite self-conscious. I did struggle with that. But I did also have really strong aspirations at the time I wanted to be a psychologist. I wanted to leave school, go to uni, train as a psychologist, and then be a psychologist. And in particular, I wanted to be a child psychologist. And I did everything I possibly could in school to make that happen. So I knew that I would need to do well in my exams. I knew that I would need to find a university that was accessible. I knew that I'd probably need a care package to do that, because up until that point, my mum and dad and my sister and my friends had helped me. But I would be going to university probably at least 150 miles away. So I knew that I would need to get all that sorted. So that was all really difficult. And it was the transition from school to university that was the most tricky part. And I think that's where we really had to fight quite a lot. And it all came down to the fact that neither the council I was living in or the council I was moving to could agree a decent package of support for me. One that was acceptable to an 18-year-old that was going to uni, as opposed to, somebody who would be sitting waiting for somebody to pop in for 10 minutes at a time. And that just wasn't an acceptable. And by the way, and I don't think that's an acceptable form of social care for anyone. I'm just saying that that's, as you know, that's the sort of the norm, unfortunately, which is terrible. So I had to fight quite hard for that. But I knew in school that I would need to do really well in certain subjects to be able to get to uni. I also knew, and I remember my school kind of pushing me towards this, and I'm grateful for it now, but at the time I was like, well, I didn't need to do that. That they made me go and properly study office and information skills so that I could touch type and learn to do all of that properly. I remember thinking, I don't know what I touch type. Like, I don't understand why I'm learning about computers or offices.
Yeah.
But in hindsight, it's a really, really strong skill.
Yeah.
Like, and as someone who's going to rely on effectively either my mouth or my words for my career, because there's not really many other parts of my body I could rely on. It was transformative. So I did that. I did my hires, and I had to stay back at school for an extra year because of the argument about social care. So I'd got my unconditional place in 5th year, had to stay on until 6th year, and then had to stay on at home another year after that because it took 2 years to sort out a care package.
Gosh, so a huge amount of effort.
Yep.
But once you were at uni, your achievements are many. But tell us a bit about how you got. I think you were a member of the union or that sort of thing. You immediately got yourself into a position of some authority, and you made things happen. So did that spark your interest in politics and fighting for what people needed to have to be able just to access the things that most people take for granted?
Yeah, definitely. So I didn't go to uni thinking I would be doing anything other than getting my degree and leaving again. Like that was my intention. And obviously, going to the bar and going to the student union and meeting pals. But in general, my time was to be spent getting my degree and leaving and getting a job. That was my aspiration. And a woman called Kelly, who's another incredible woman who, I know a lot of really incredible women, and she's one of them, approached me in the sort of atrium where I was having lunch one day, and she was like, student council's looking for a disabled person to be a representative on it to represent disabled people. You look like you could fit the bill. Are you available? And I said, well, 10 out of 10 for observation, Kelly, but to be honest with you, I'm just here to get my degree, haven't thought about representation, not really keen to take too much on. She was like, no, come along, you might like it. So curious as I am, I did go along, and the discussion that night was about the student union and basically refurbishing it. And part of the conversation went to talk about the lift that would be installed to get people down into the bar. Now, I had a significant interest in getting down into the bar at the time because I had quite enjoyed a light lemonade in it. And so I'd listened carefully, obviously, at this point. And they started to talk about a key would be available, and somebody would go and collect a key and make yourself known, and et cetera, et cetera. I thought, why do you need to go through all that palaver? Like, why is the lift not just available with a button? Like, why do you not just press the lift and get in it? Like, what's the deal with the key, right? So they were like, their immediate reaction was, what's the problem with the key? Whereas I was like, what's the deal with the key, if you know what I mean? So they're like, why is it an issue? And I'm like, why have you even got it? And that disconnect between their overarching view, which was, what is the problem with creating another stage through which someone has to go to? Because in their head, they were keeping it safe and preserving the lift for its sole purpose, which would be to presumably bring deliveries up and down to the bar, and occasionally if disabled people needed to use it, they could. So they couldn't understand why going to collect a key was such a big deal. I couldn't understand why they needed to lock anyone out. Like, I was like, well, don't imagine folk are going to flock to use your lift. Like, and actually, let me start telling you about the number of barriers that disabled people have to go through every day. And the extra time it takes us to do anything because of precisely the point you've just had. So that kind of swayed them. And it was that point and that day that I realised that if you're not in the room, you're not able to influence it. And there's no one else in that room who would have made that, who would have said that. Not because they were bad people, not because they weren't bad people, by the way, they were great people, and not because they were malintended, none of them were, but purely because they didn't have a full sort of appreciation for some of the additional barriers that you face as a disabled person. And if a disabled person's not in the room, who else is going to say it?
Absolutely. I've always been baffled as to why they keep disabled loos locked in many cases. I mean, anyway, we won't go there. Can you give us any tips for young people with JIA who aspire to go to university but are worried about going away from home and suddenly finding they haven't got that, reliable comfort support that the family brings? What would you say to young people with JIA today who want to go to uni?
Start early. So start thinking about it early. And it shouldn't be that we have to do this, but it took me 2 years of constant fight after I had already got the education requirements that were needed. So you can't start this early enough. I brought a bill to the Scottish Parliament to try and make this happen legally and have a legal right to it. It didn't pass, but I still think it should have, but obviously I would say that. But you need to start early because it does take time, and it shouldn't take time, and it annoys me that it takes time, and everything should be much, much easier to do. But we live in the world we live in, and whilst we do live in that world, my advice is take the time. So start thinking about what you want to do, probably in about third year, no later, and have an eye on where you want to go. The other thing I would say is try and have a conversation with other disabled people, other people with JIA who may or may have not have gone to that university that you've got an interest in, or the college you've got an interest in, or even done the apprenticeship you want to do, or whatever your aspirations are for after school. Try and find someone else who's done it and been in a similar position. I've always said this, and all of my social media DMs are open for this reason. I mean, they're a bit of a bin fire, but that's a different story. My DMs are open, and if anybody who has JIA is watching this and wants to know where to start or who to speak to, I'm more than happy to help. I've always said I will do that. So try and find someone else that's gone where you want to go, and ask them. Make connections with so if it's university, speak to the student union. I met the student union very, very early on because I wanted to get their perspective, and they were unbelievable in connecting me to friends, helping me make friends, helping me find things to do that weren't uni courses, just stuff to fill my time. Because as a disabled person, it's not always easy to get. For a start, I was never going to join the football team, or so the sports union wasn't an option for me. Now that's changed. We're going back 20 odd years, so. Yeah, there'll be more options for people now in terms of clubs and societies to join, but there weren't that many when I was in uni. But the student union made sure I was included and involved and kind of took me under their wing. So contact your student union as early as you can.
Yeah, and of course now there are disability services within universities which help with finding a new GP presumably, or a new rheumatology team and so on. Yeah. So tell us about your first job post uni. Did you face any discrimination in the workplace? Was it hard to get a first job?
So before I went to uni, the very first job I had was answering phones in a taxi office. And I had got that job because I had been told I couldn't go to uni again for another year. And my mum said, well, you're not hanging about here doing nothing, and you can't go back to school because you've done all 6 years. They won't take you back now. You're out. But you're not sitting about doing nothing, so you need to get a job. So I went to try and get a job locally. And there weren't many options because of where I lived. There was an advert in the local taxi office. I went in and said, can I apply? And they said, oh, the job's taken. My mum then went in a few days later and they were like, oh yeah, you can have the job. So they gave my mum the job. And on the Monday she was due to start, she brought me and she was like, we're both doing it until you can see that Pam can actually do the job. And so they were quite so it was almost like, so I learned a lot of things in that one experience, which was, one, I'm going to face discrimination. 2, you just need to do it. And if people force your way in. I'm a huge fan of positive action for that reason, incidentally. And sometimes once you get in the door, non-disabled people can see the value of disabled people, because very, very quickly the people in that organisation were like, oh, you can do this job perfectly well. And I was like, well, yeah, it's answering phones. So that was my first experience. After uni, I got a job in Glasgow Centre for Inclusive Living. It was probably the 5th or 6th job I applied for, which is actually really quite good, if I'm honest. I was quite lucky. They were a great organisation, and I loved working there. I worked there for 4 years, and then I went on to work in the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which I also loved.
Right. And how did you then get involved in politics, and when did you become an MSP?
I actually joined the Labour Party when I was in uni, so around about 2003 or 4, I think, probably, maybe a wee bit earlier. And the reason I did is because at the time, a lot of the stuff that I was wanting to try and change, I could see that was wrong. The government of the day, and I know this is not about being party political, so I won't dwell, but the government of the day were doing a lot of things that I thought were good things for disabled people. They gave me an untold amount of opportunity. The job I spoke about a minute ago, answering phones, I got £2 an hour for it. That changed when the minimum wage came in. So things like that got me involved. So I joined the party, and through that, I met some incredible people in the labour movement, joined trade unions, became a trade union rep, and a lot of different people, including the MP in Stirling at the time, Anne Maguire, who continues to be a massive inspiration for me, took me under her wing, gave me some advice and support about how to change things, how to campaign, how to influence people who can make decisions and people of power, and really just gave me opportunities and platforms. And that continued all the way through the jobs that I did whilst I was kind of volunteering, as it were, for the party, all the way up to Anas, who Anas Sarwar, who's leader at the Scottish Labour Party just now, and is incredible. And he gave me loads and loads of platforms and encouragement. And I just saw that representative democracy was where you could change things. So you can change a lot of things outside Parliament, a lot. And actually, before I got to Parliament, some of the stuff I'm most proud of I did before I was a parliamentarian. But I could see that sometimes the law was the problem, and I just wanted to change it and couldn't, and it was frustrating. And so I wanted to get myself in the room where you can change the law. And so that's how I ended up where I am. A lot of it was by accident, not design, if I'm honest. It was kind of just progression and more interested and more opportunity, and then I could see where things were happening and ended up being what feels like quite a natural place to be.
Yeah, indeed. I've been in Holyrood a number of times, and I don't recall it being a terribly disabled friendly building. Can you tell us about a typical day in the life of Pam Duncan-Glancy, first of all in Parliament, and then about the work you do in your constituency?
So the first thing I'd say is that there's not really any typical day. Like it's just like this job just doesn't resemble anything I've ever done or known, to be honest. So I'll try and be as, like, in general, the kind of rhythm of my week is on a Monday, I spend Monday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday in my region, and Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday in Edinburgh in Parliament. Now that varies sometimes, not least in recess when I'm in the region in Glasgow all the time working instead. But sometimes I'll maybe not be in Parliament Tuesday, Wednesday or Thursday because something's happening in the region and I need to be there. And so you can, you get what's called slipped, which is permission to not be in the Parliament. You've got to have special permission for that, but you can get it. But in general, on a Monday, I'm in the region, and most often than not, Monday's about meeting constituents, visiting organisations, supporting some campaigns locally that might need some help, and learning about what are the issues that matter most to people. And lately, I've spent a lot of time on picket lines because we've had quite a few strikes in Scotland, particularly in education. So I've been out and about on picket lines. It's usually, I'd say, Monday's probably the shortest day. So I usually would work from about 8:30 a.m. till about 5. So that's probably the shortest day I do. And then Tuesday, I do some work in the constituency on a Tuesday morning. So maybe it's a bit of emails and catching up on policy work and meeting some people locally, again, constituents or otherwise. And then I have my education team meetings. So I'm the Shadow Cabinet Secretary for Education. So we, as a team, I've got policy and press, and I've also got a shadow minister in my team as well, who works with me. So we all meet on a Tuesday morning and then go through to Parliament. the Labour Party MSPs meet on a Tuesday. So we have that meeting. And then we're in Parliament for topical questions and debate in the afternoon on a Tuesday. And then there's usually events going on at lunchtime that you would pop in and out of in Parliament as well, some of which I would host and speak at, others I would go and visit and pop into and learn about an organisation or a particular cause. And then you would go to the chamber, do listen to the debate, contribute in some debates as well, ask questions, and then vote at the end of the day. So we have what we call decision time. So that's usually between 5 and 6. Sometimes it's later. Last week it went on till 9 o'clock at night, for example. And then there's usually evening events to go to where you go and support causes or various different organisations. And then on a Wednesday, I'm in committee, education committee. So that's usually from about 8:30 a.m. till about 1. And then I stay over in Edinburgh on a Tuesday night in general. I didn't originally. I travelled, but if I was going late to an event on a Tuesday, I was getting home about 10 at night to be back in Edinburgh by 8:30 in the morning. I was literally going home to go straight to bed to come back up. Like, it just wasn't feasible, and I was exhausted. So I took the decision that I needed to stay in Edinburgh. So stay over on a Tuesday, do my committee. Then there's again the kind of cycle of Parliament questions, debate, events, and then Thursday we meet as a shadow cabinet, and also there's First Minister's questions and then debates. Usually leave Parliament on a Thursday after decision time at 5 or 6, come back to Glasgow, sometimes have local Labour Party meetings, and then Friday's constituency. I do all my surgeries on a Friday, regular surgeries and supermarket surgeries, and then it's kind of back into events, meetings for local issues that I need to. And Saturday is supporting local events like FETs and stuff like that. So it's a different rhythm on a Saturday. It's a nicer kind of, more just being here, but also supporting local community things. And then some Sundays I try and go to the park with the dog.
Well, that brings me on to the next question, which I hesitate to ask now. I know you're married to Hugh, so tell us a bit about what life is like when you're not working, which doesn't seem to be very much of the week.
It's a vanishingly small amount of time, to be honest. It's so Hugh and I, I met Hugh in 2005. So he's been on this whole entire journey. And that's what I would say is so important. And it's incredible that I've got a really supportive husband, because I don't think you could do it if you didn't have family that supported you, because they need to put up with a hell of a lot. Short notice change. For example, the most recent inconvenience for his life was that we were booked to go away on holiday on the 5th of July, which we had to change because the election was called.
Yes.
So stuff like that, you just, and it's like, there's no negotiating. It's like, sorry, that's cancelled, can't go now. So we've moved it. So, but there's so much that he needs to put up with that. I'm just so incredibly lucky to have him. He's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful man. We spend a lot of time when we get time together. We like to go out for food and meals, like to go to musicals, like to walk the dog in the park. We like to go away if we can on maybe kind of prefer city breaks to hot holidays, if you know what I mean, because I quite enjoy doing stuff like that. We love going to London together. It's one of our favourite places. So whenever we get the time, we do that. And then we are both interested in politics. So, for example, I came back from Parliament last night, which is Thursday, and got home, and Hugh was like, so we'll watch all the politics shows, like Sophie Ridge, the Channel 4 News, all the different ones that are on at 7 o'clock. And I'm like, more politics, okay. So yeah, that's basically, yeah. But the dog, we spend a bit of time with the dog. Yeah. He's our favourite thing in the world.
Yeah, animals make a big difference, don't they? So coming back to JIA, there's been a revolution in regard to how inflammatory arthritis is treated, both in children and, of course, in adults, with the advent of the biologics at the turn of the century. So thankfully, we won't be seeing people like you and me who've got a lot of disability because we were diagnosed such a long time ago. But we do have, looking forward, a very serious situation with a broken NHS. with workforce issues in primary and secondary care, as well as the backlog of patients as a consequence of the pandemic and so on. So what are your hopes for children and young people diagnosed with JIA going forward, and then more generally for people living with long-term disability and long-term conditions?
So first of all, my hope is that we continue to make the unbelievable steps and strides in research that we have done, so that we can provide the support, medication and intervention to children and young people, so that they don't end up being really, really badly damaged by JIA. So I want to see more progression of that as much as we can. In my lifetime, as I say, we've seen a massive amount of progression. There's no doubt in my mind I would not be in the condition that I am had the drugs that are available now been available to me when I was younger. So more of that, please. My other hopes are that society becomes a lot more of a better space to be a disabled person in, because regardless of the efforts of research and what we can do in terms of drugs and therapies and surgeries and all the rest of it, undoubtedly disability will still continue, and and that's a good thing. We're all glorious in our diversity, but I really want to see a society where it's much, much better to be a disabled person than it is right now. It's pretty tough for most, if not all, disabled people in this country just now, be it because of the state of the NHS, be it because of the state of difficulties getting work, lack of support, discrimination you experience, inaccessible housing, inaccessible transport, care charges. Like, there's a whole, I could list and list and list, as we all could. So my hope is that we can build and create a better society for disabled people through our collective endeavours as disabled people, but with our allies.
Great. Well, no one can have failed to notice that we've got a general election coming up very shortly. Without getting into party politics, what are your ambitions for the future? For example, with your disabled children and young people transitioning into adulthood bill, are you going to try and get that through in the next Parliament of whatever colour?
So I brought that bill in the Scottish Parliament, and the elections to the Scottish Parliament will be in 2026, and I would hope to see it in manifestos, but I'd also hope that there would be an opportunity to do and take action on it before then. It's a devolved matter, so it is something that we can do, and isn't necessarily all that dependent on the election on the 4th of July, although I think there's a number of ways in which the outcome of the election on the 4th of July could improve the situation, but I'll constrain myself from commenting at this moment on that. I think people can probably guess what I want, but in terms of the transitions and the elements of the bill, I think there are different ways that I can try and pursue aspects of it. I can't bring the bill back in this session. Once it's fallen at stage 1, it's fallen at stage 1 for the entire session, so I can't bring it back. Could bring it back if I'm re-elected in 2026. I could bring it back. Someone else could bring it back. The government of 2026, whoever they are in whatever colour, could choose to bring it as well. So I said when the bill fell that I wouldn't stop fighting for the aspects of it, for all of what it would do, and I'll keep doing that. So there's various different bits of legislation coming up that the government are bringing that I think we could take action in. The most recent one, I was disappointed because, to be honest, I asked the Minister if we could use the opportunity of the Learning Disability Bill to do something, and effectively she said no. So that was disappointing, but there's lots of opportunities, and I will seek them out and use them where I can.
Well, you'll certainly have our support with that one. Pam, it has been a privilege to speak to you today. Your resilience in the face of adversity and your determination to do all that you can to help your community and to speak up on behalf of disabled people whose voice is often unheard is a shining inspiration to us all. So thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank you so much for all that you and NRAS do. I wouldn't be here today, almost quite literally, without you and your organisation. So thank you for doing it.
Well, that's kind of you to say. Thank you.